The F8 series of M car is now more affordable than ever. You can now pick one of these cars up for the same price as your average economy hatchback. With these huge savings from new, we believe now is the perfect time to buy. And not only that, with a few modifications from the huge performance parts catalogue available for these cars, you can turn your M3 or M4 into a straight up supercar killer.
And that brings us here. We've listened to our own advice and we've bought one. But this one isn't your average M4. As you can see, it's got a few nice tasteful modifications on the outside, but what you can't see is hidden away under the bonnet. The previous owner upgraded to our big hybrid turbos and all the relevant supporting mods, meaning this F82 M4 produces close to 700 horsepower. Now you may be asking yourself, what does bolting big turbos to an S55 do to the reliability and the drivability? Well, in the next few episodes, we're going to be finding out by testing this car in the 3 most common car enthusiast hobbies: drag racing, circuit days, and drift days. And we're not going to be hiding what breaks. We're going to use these episodes to find out the things that you actually need on these cars and what upgrades are a complete waste of money. And as soon as we're done testing the car in its current state, we're going to be upgrading to the next level of performance package. But first, let's test this car in the most common place where you're going to be, the road. Let's start this road test off with the boring yet important things first. First thing I want to talk about is comfort. Obviously, when you're buying an M4 or an F8 series M car, you're not particularly buying it for comfort. However, you're probably going to be doing a lot of miles in this car and you're going to want to make sure that you're not going to break your back when you're going on long journeys. The ride in this car is perfectly fine. There's absolutely nothing to really complain about. The seats, albeit a little bit hard, this has got the comp seats in, and personally I prefer the comfort of the non-comp seats, but these don't really feel a great deal different. They're still quite hard. In comparison to the old E90, the seats do feel a little bit less comfortable. This particular one has the BC coilovers fitted, which, to be honest, albeit they are a little bit more noisy than stock, they're perfectly compliant on the road, and there's not really a lot more that you can wish for them, really. To be honest, just driving around normal roads, they don't really feel much different to normal suspension, despite this car being a hell of a lot lower. One thing that's also great about this car is when you don't want it to be a full loud ASBO M car, you can put it in efficient and you can drive along perfectly quietly and no one will even notice you come in. The engine on this with the valves closed is no louder. Even with the exhaust modifications that are on this car, which we'll get onto in a little while, even with the exhaust modifications with the valves closed, this car's no louder than your average Golf GTI. Also, the steering has different settings, so you can change your steering from sport to comfort and even sports plus, which basically makes the steering more stiff the more sportier you go. I personally prefer it in the sport mode. Some people like it in comfort mode for even driving around on track because they just feel it's too aggressive. We haven't tested this on track yet, so we'll come up with our own conclusion on that in future episodes. Coming through some bumpy lanes now, and with these BCs on, it still drives perfectly fine. In the E90 with the slightly harder suspension, we would have been bouncing all over the place around these lanes. You can definitely feel a lot less negative feedback through your bum and through the steering wheel coming down tight, twisty, bumpy lanes, which you get so much of in the UK. Let's move on to talk about the handling. Compared to the E-Series car, the chassis on this is another level. I personally think that this chassis is quite possibly one of the best chassis that BMW's ever produced. The way it's designed is more motorsport based. You've got solid bushes wherever you can, and wherever there has to be bushes for comfort and noise, they're as small as possible and as compact as possible. Yes, they are rubber bushes, but they're almost as solid in many places as poly bushes. And this means that the overall experience in this car is a hell of a lot more precise, it's a hell of a lot more direct and predictable. Even comparing it to the E-Series car that we've got with solid subframe bushes and poly bushes in the rear. The suspension on this car just encourages you to keep going. On the subject of handling in our car, there is something that we're going to have to work on with it. It does feel ever so slightly twitchy on the rear. However, this car was previously set up for drag racing, so I believe that a slightly less aggressive toe setup on the back is probably going to help with that. But we're going to cover that more in future episodes. And also, when we're moving on to the drifting and the track days, we're going to talk about different suspension setups that you would want to run on these anyway. The car's straight line speed, even in standard form, when you compare it to similar cars that you can buy for the same sort of money, it's completely unmatched. With the few small modifications that this car's had done, it is a complete other level. Now this car is running our 7XX turbos, which are the bigger hybrid turbos. We normally recommend these turbos more for a drag racing or a roll racing type of setup. We'd normally recommend smaller turbos for a track setup or a drift setup, purely because these bigger turbos do have slightly more lag. But that being said, with this car, it's a perfect opportunity to see what disadvantages we're going to have running these bigger turbos with the things that we're planning on doing with it. And we'll also be able to work out if we're going to be better off sticking with these turbos, or maybe we're better off changing the setup ever so slightly, depending on what we want to do with it. So if you've driven or owned one of these cars, you'll know that the power in standard form comes in kind of one big bucket. It comes in nice and low down, but if you're trying to rev the engine out, there's not really much point because you tend to lose a little bit of power up in the higher range. When you fit hybrid turbos to these cars, it allows you to have power all the way up to the red line. The power comes in slightly later and more linear, but it builds as the revs increase, which I personally think makes it a hell of a lot easier to drive, especially when you're doing a track day, for example, because you're coming out of a corner at say 3000 RPM and you're not got to worry about it being at its peak boost at that point. And also the hybrids are a very popular upgrade on these cars because the turbos are so common for failing. Generally, you'll be lucky to get around 50,000 miles out of a stock set of turbos. So it's worth knowing that if you're thinking about buying one of these cars, you will either end up replacing the turbos for a stock setup or potentially upgrading in the future. Now, supporting mods to get it to the power that it is now, you're generally going to need a crank hub. You'd need that if you're going stage one anyway. You'll need exhaust modifications such as downpipes and a mid pipe if you really want to get the most out of them, and some form of tuning, and then you're about there. The 6XX turbos that we produce, they don't really require too much custom tuning. You can run them quite safely on a stage 2H map on boot mod. You will obviously still have to buy the license from boot mod. The off-the-shelf map that's there works really nicely with the 6XX hybrid turbos. When you upgrade to the 7XX turbos, you are going to need to look into custom mapping. You don't need any air filter modifications. Some panel filters would be nice and it'll help them the best they can, but do not make the mistake of fitting open air filters to these cars. The only open air filters that actually make a difference to power are the front mount intakes, but they have been known to cause issues with driving in the rain, for example. So if you're in the UK like us, you're going to experience some issues with running when the weather changes outside, which isn't ideal because most of the time in the UK it's raining. So some of you may be wondering what the extra power has done for the drivability of the car. Now, as we mentioned before, it's got efficiency mode. So when you're driving around in that, it doesn't really feel too much different than a stock car. Obviously, if you put your foot down, you're still going to have that extra power there, but you can still give this car to somebody else and tell them to drive it normally, and they could mistake it for being stock. But when you want to be a bit Asbo and press the M2 button, it's a completely different animal. In all honesty, if you're planning on going full beans on the road with this car, in many situations it's probably a bit too much on the road. The only real application where you may need this sort of horsepower is on a long stretch of unrestricted autobahn where you're going to really push the sort of limits of speed, but just driving around country lanes and going on a fast road drive, you really don't need that much power, because it does stuff like that where you just try to drive out normally, especially in M mode. So you can hear it then. I'm literally quarter throttle and I'm already at warp speed. So using all the power, you're never going to use it on a road like this, not unless you're a complete hooligan. But it's nice to know it's there in case you did want to be a complete hooligan. Another upgrade that's well worth doing in these cars is improving the gearbox by mapping it with XHP. And you can further improve the gearbox by fitting these nice PlayStation style flappy paddle controllers. It's just so satisfying to change gear with these. Just the noise just makes you feel like you're playing a video game. Might not be to everyone's taste, but I personally really like them. So in this we have the DCT gearbox, which compared to the E90 where we had so many issues trying to get the gearbox to work, there is so many off-the-shelf options for tuning this gearbox. This particular one's got the XHP Stage 3, which the main thing that it improves is how fast it shifts and how aggressive it shifts. But also, some of you who've got these cars that maybe tuned to Stage 1 or Stage 2 without gearbox mapping, you'll know that these cars tend to be a little bit jerky in first and second gear. Very often you can pull off with these and start kangarooing down the road. The XHP map with Stage 2 upwards, well even Stage 1, makes a huge difference to that, and it makes it a hell of a lot more drivable. I won't go into the exact science of it in this video, but just know that when you go XHP Stage 3, you don't really need to do a hell of a lot more to the gearbox, even when you're running this sort of power. Now we can't do a full review on this without talking briefly about the reliability issues on these cars. It is well documented, the common problems that these cars have. I'll just briefly go over the most common things that we see on a daily basis when we're repairing these. Crank hubs, big one. Turbos, big one. Cam alignment, rocker cover gasket leaks, sump gasket leaks, charge cooler leaks. On the pre-OPF cars, the diff bushes are quite common for splitting. And one thing we're seeing a bit more recently on convertibles is rear drive shafts, CVs failing. But the good thing about all those common problems is there are upgrades available to fully fix them problems and also upgrade the handling and performance when you change them. So that pretty much concludes our road test. We're very, very happy with the car. The upgrades that have been added to this car before we've owned it have completely transformed it and made it into a completely different animal than the ones that you would buy off the shelf from BMW. We're really, really excited to get going on the next stage of development with this car, and we're excited to take you guys along with us for the fun. The next place you're going to see this car is at the drag strip. So let's see how we get on there.